All right, Bill Connelly's returning production number. South Carolina ranks the fourth lowest in the SEC. What does that trend mean going into 2025? We talk about all that and more. Locked on Gamecocks starts right now.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into Locked On Gamecocks. I'm your host, Chris Marler. We've got two shows for you today. This is the first of two, and the only football one we are going to have, as we will get into a full preview of the Clemson series in baseball later on today as well. But before we do, want to say thank you so much to everyone making Locked On Gamecocks your first listen each and every day. Shout out to our everydayers. Remember, we're a free and available podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's show brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, if you are a new customer right now, all new customers for FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Make sure you go to FanDuel.com to sign up today. Now, let's get into today's episode. It's something that is a very data-driven, analytically driven, statistically driven, which you guys know I love a deep dive, and we will get into it, and I will hopefully be able to explain it as well as possible. Bill Connelly does a ranking every February, and then he updates it throughout the year. He is the all-time numbers crunching college football data guy, works for ESPN, does a phenomenal job, and he's the one in charge of the S&P Plus rankings that come out, the prediction model, all that kind of stuff. Not FPI, but S&P and that prediction model as well. Does a tremendous job, and these are some of the numbers that come out every year that I'm most excited to see, because it's the returning production from last year's team. Now, right off the bat, I will tell you some of the numbers. It's alarming, but they don't always matter for certain teams based on what teams are trying to go for the portal and what teams are how they're trying to build their rosters through that. Now, this South Carolina team, it's in a weird, not unprecedented, I don't want to say, but it's in a weird new situation that I have not seen them find themselves in before. Going into the 2025 season, the South Carolina Gamecocks are ranked 71st in the country in terms of returning production, 71st. Now, in the SEC, that ranks fourth worst or fourth fewest in the SEC. That means 56% of their overall offensive and defensive production from last year's team returns. The only teams they're ahead of, Ole Miss, who is the lowest in the SEC, with, let me see here, at 113th at just 42%. They rank actually 104th or worse on both offense and defense. So a lot of production they had to replace. Ahead of them is Georgia at 105, who returns just 45%. And then Texas at 103, who returns just 45%, including they're at only 29% on offense, which ranks 126 in the country. Like I said, South Carolina sits here right at 71. The teams that are on the SEC that are ahead of them, you see Arkansas is at 64, Tennessee's at 58, Kentucky, Mizzou, they're right around the top 50 as well. But I want to focus it on South Carolina, obviously, since we're a South Carolina show. Now, the good news out of this is I think, two things, because there's good and bad news. Let's start with the good news. There are these numbers and the trends and what this means, okay? And Bill Connelly, like I said, it's very analytically driven. One of the things that he makes a point to bring up in these things is he's been attempting to expand how we measure returning production. The formula he created shifts each year with data, and had to shift a ton with a rising number of transfers. Okay, now when he puts out the initial S&P projections that comes later this week, it's based on a forever changing combination that includes returning production, recruiting, recent history, all those kind of things. All those things are projected to be in favor of South Carolina and where they are moving forward. Now, the other part is this. I look at the two numbers where you stand currently for South Carolina, and the two numbers indicate you have the 40th overall returning production for offense, and 99th in defense. Now, the 99th in defense is not ideal, right? But here's the thing, and let me try to spin this in a positive way. The 40% you have, like the concern you have coming into each season so far in the Shane Beamer era has been offense, right? Like, and not saying that the offense has been super concerning or bad but it's behind the defense. And that's way more of a testament to what Clayton White has built as a defensive coordinator. The 99th percentage in production, I look at that number and I think, okay, well, what did you have returning last year? Obviously, you had Eamon Warry, right? You had Eamon Warry. You had a ton of talent in the interior defensive line. Tonka, Sanders, Jules. Like you had a bunch of dudes in the middle of that defensive line that were really good. You also had Debo Williams sitting there right in the middle as your Mike linebacker, your middle linebacker, and probably not a Mike since you're in a 3-3-5 or 4-2-5, the nickel flex. But the new guys you brought in on the team, talk about Demetrius Knight Jr., Kyle Kennard, then you have Dylan Stewart as a true freshman. There's no way to gauge that he was going to have that level of production as a true freshman. Not a ton of way to gauge that Kyle Kennard was going to, oh, by the way, put up 2.5 times the amount of production he had at another Power 4 program at Georgia Tech, making that shift from the ACC to the SEC and then putting up 2.5 times the numbers. Very hard thing to predict. So when I look at the 99th overall projection or 99th overall number for the returning defensive production you have, when I look at that is I say, listen, we have talked about this number ad nauseum. You lose 40% of your total tackles on defense just in your 3 linebackers alone, right? You lose a lot of your sack production and the numbers that you have there, the tackles for loss and some of those explosive, disruptive, game-changing defensive type plays. You lose a lot of that on paper. But when you have a guy like Clayton White and you've recruited at this level, right, where you're bringing in transfers and the kid from Missouri and you're bringing in new linebackers and you got guys on in that, like Fred Robinson already on the roster already. Then you talk about like Donovan Darden coming in as a true freshman, being able to contribute right away. There are a lot of people already. On this roster, I think, that can step in and contribute right away. So and by the way, Fred Johnson, not Fred Robinson, I don't know what I'm talking about here. But you have all these types of players, high-level 4-star recruits with a year under their belt. I'm not worried about the defense, even though it's at 99, okay? And one of the things it also tells me is you might find yourself in a situation where maybe you take a step back statistically on defense, right? Maybe a step back statistically, but from a schematic standpoint, we have seen the consistency of that side of the ball just prevail and reign true no matter what. So then I look at the offensive side of the ball and I say, wow, number 40 in the country in overall offensive returning production, where does that rank among other SEC teams? Well, when you look at it, Auburn returns, I think they're 21st overall. Let's see here. I'm going through here. A&M ranks 19th. A&M, by the way, highest ranked SEC team at 6th in total production returning. They're in the top 20 of both, something that's very, very impressive. Now, the bad news, we're going to get to it right after the break. Okay. We're going to get to it right after the break. Overall, I think you're in a very good situation. It sucks that you're sitting here looking at your 4th fewest in the SEC. And in years past, I look at that and I'm thinking, oh my God, how are they going to be able to replace this? But here's the thing. The cornerstone pieces you have in place, and you look at the offense now, especially that's 40th, they return 65% of their production versus 46% on defense. I look at that number and I say, you've got one of the best quarterbacks in the country. You've got a receiving core that's as deep as it's been in probably the last decade. You have the defense that has a lot of people to replace, but then you also go back to the positions of need and the positions that are most important on the field, right? Let's start with number 1, quarterback. You're great there. Left tackle. You got one of the best young left tackles in the conference, maybe the country, Josiah Thompson. Then you talk about the defensive end. Dylan Stewart, probably the best edge rusher coming back in the country from last season. Big things expected out of him. He was the number 2 player, returning player in the country, behind, I think, Jeremiah Smith in a recent top 100 poll that was released of the top 100 college football players returning for the next season. So you have that. And then you look at the other positions of need that are important. Defensive back. Well, you're super young, but you're really good there. You got a lot of talent there. And, oh, by the way, you went out into the portal and got one of the best portal defensive backs as well from NC State. Then you look at the other positions of importance. I wouldn't say, I keep saying positions of need. What I should say is positions of importance, the offensive line. And all you did on the offensive line was shore up a lot of your vulnerability your vulnerable points and weaknesses, where you brought in size, you brought in experience, and you have other guys that are already on that roster that were able to take a year to progress and get better and get bigger and physically ready. So in that scenario, I don't think this is something that you're going to have a massive step back, even though the numbers have said in the past for certain programs that you might. Now, we're going to get into that a little bit after the break as well, and also get into what the bad news is from those rankings. Now, before we do, want to give a huge shout out to our friends at FanDuel. You guys heard me talk about them in the opener, and you're going to hear me talk about them again. Now, but we are going into the final week of February, which is crazy. We're already almost 2 months in. It's like January takes 8 years to get through, and then February is like a couple of days. But when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. Now, the action only continues and only gets better over at FanDuel. And right now, new users with FanDuel can get up to $150 in bonus bets if they win their first $5 bet. It's why there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, and so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to be on a fourth quarter comeback or anything in between, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Would highly recommend. I love using it. I love using stuff in the pregame where you can go into not just money line, the spread, and totals and over-unders. You can get into team totals. You can get into first half bets. You can get into player props as well. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So close. All right, so we'll be right back with more Locked On Gamecocks. Stay tuned. All right, let's get back into the topic at hand and get into a little. I just want to kind of dive into a little bit more what the numbers are as a whole, and before we get into the bad news, which isn't like bad news. It's just one of the teams near the top, at the top, you don't want to see at the top, and we'll get into that in a second. Now, the thing that stands out most to me about these, because I think it's so hard to be able to calculate this and piece it all together and say, hey, here's returning production, because here's the thing. I mean, you look at, I love to bring this specific person up, and it's Demetrius Knight Jr., because that's a guy that not even at the Power 4 level, he was at Charlotte before he got to South Carolina, but he had like 94 or 98 total tackles, 3 interceptions, 1 return for a touchdown, several tackles for loss, like 1.5 sacks, something like that. That's a kid that had no level of production at the Power 4 level and was not returning production for your team coming in. Now, Bill Connelly's obviously smarter than I am. He probably doesn't struggle with numbers at all, or stuttering through ad reads or whatever, or probably doesn't talk with his hands as much. Anyway, I say all that to tell you, I know that he has some of this in place as a way to kind of alleviate or fix the issues and flaws that go into it inherently. Like, that, not that his numbers are flawed, but because of the state of college football and how everything is changing and we have the transfer portal and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure he has a way to go through all that. Now, case in point, you talk about returning production, it's lower than ever. It's lower than it's ever been going into 2025 because, in part, of the transfer portal. From the time he started this is in 2021 to now, the numbers have decreased by 23%. And going into the 2021 season, you had 76.7% of overall production returning. You were at 75% or more on offense and defense. Only time that's happened. You have not been over 65 or even 64 in any other year. 2022, it dropped to 63. 2023, it dropped to 60. 2024, not much change, just down to 59.9. But now you're talking about 53.7% overall. I told you the numbers in 2021, you had an average of 75% or more in both offensive returning production and defensive returning production. Fast forward to 2025 and these initial numbers, which are only going to change, right? Because you're going to have the portal open for 10 more days after the spring window. So it's only going to change even more. But the returning production, neither of them are over even 55%, which is kind of insane. Now, the bad news here, the team that ranks number one overall is Clemson, and I hate that. Clemson is at number one with 81% of their overall production returning. That's 86% on offense, which ranks number one nationally, and then seventh nationally on defense at 75%. That's insane. That's an insane level of production coming back. Part of that is because Dabo has been very limited in returning or in going into the transfer portal. But part of it also is the fact that Clemson's going to be a juggernaut. Like, that game is the most important game on the schedule every year. But this year especially, I don't know if it's ever meant more on a national level. Maybe you guys can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm sure like some of those years in the early 2010s, you had both teams ranked very high. I don't know if you're going to see the level of talent on both sides of the ball. Like the one that sticks out to me the most is probably 2013. That's like a Taj Boyd and all the talent they had on the field then versus like Jadeveon Clowney and a lot of the talent you had on the field for South Carolina. But I don't think you're going to see this amount of talent from both sides combined than like ever in the history of the rivalry than you will see this year. This should be the most talented on-field collection of talent from both sides combined that we've ever seen in the rivalry, ever, which is insane. So Clemson being number one, it sucks. The other part of it that I don't love, you start looking at some of the opponents that you have for South Carolina, because a lot of it has to do with the schedule. We know that more than anything in the SEC. Sometimes it's just you have a great team, but you also play a murderer's row in terms of the schedule. Georgia had to do it last year. Obviously, South Carolina does it every single year. And there's other teams that don't. Ole Miss, Texas, they get to dodge a lot of good teams a year ago. Now, there are 4 teams in the top 10 in the country in returning production that South Carolina will have to face. Clemson's at 1, A&M is at 2. I'm sorry, A&M's at 6, Vanderbilt is at 8, and Oklahoma is at 10. Now, the good news out of those 4 teams, you get 3 of the 4 at home, which we love. But it's still that's a difficult thing. I'm not sure if there's anyone else in the country that has to face 4. I'm looking at it right now. I'm pretty sure there's not. That would have to face 4 top 10 teams on the schedule. So that is all for today's initial look at the returning production set aside from Bill Connelly, the S&P rankings, and, by the way, ESPN. So make sure you tune in later tonight. We got a great episode coming your way. That's going to be previewing the Clemson series this weekend. Massive deal on the diamond as South Carolina and Clemson renew their annual rivalry in baseball. So make sure you stick around for that. Until next time, go Cox. See y'all later.